On the show today, we have guest Toby Karten. Toby is an experienced educator, author, university professor, and consultant specializing in inclusive education. She is known for her work in promoting inclusive practices in PK through 12 schools. Karten has written numerous books and resources on inclusive education, preventing strategies for teachers to support all learners effectively. She often conducts professional development workshops and presentations to help administrators, educators, students and families implement inclusive strategies in their classrooms and onward. Today, she'd like to discuss implementation of the Admire framework for inclusion. Positive strategies pave the way for students of all abilities. Get ready for a great episode.
I'm educational justice coach Lindsay Lyons, and here on the Time for Teachership podcast, we learn how to inspire educational innovation for racial and gender justice, design curricula grounded in student voice, and build capacity for shared leadership. I'm a former teacher leader turned instructional coach. I'm striving to live a life full of learning, running, baking, traveling, and parenting because we can be rockstar educators and be full human beings. If you're a principal, assistant superintendent, curriculum director, instructional coach, or teacher who enjoys nerding out about co-created curriculum with students, I made this show for you. Here we go. Toby, welcome to the Time for Teachership podcast.
Thank you for having me, Lindsay. It's a pleasure to be here and to share some knowledge with the listeners.
I'm excited to learn along with listeners, along from you. And I just finished your book, The Admire Frameworks. I'm really excited to talk about that today. So that's definitely on my mind. Is there anything on your mind, anything you want listeners to kind of know about you or kind of the audience to keep in mind as we jump into our conversation today?
Sure. You said you're going to learn from me, but I learn from the people I work with, and that includes the administrators, the teachers, the students, the families, because even though we might have knowledge like I have in the Admire framework for inclusion with Solution Tree, I don't have all the answers until we collaborate with others. So I think that's what we're doing here. And some of my background, just quickly, has been in special education since undergraduate, before it was called IDEA. It was quite a few moons ago. And it's wonderful to see things progress in a positive way. And we want to make sure we stay on that track. That's why we keep having conversations like this one.
Oh, that's a beautiful framing. Thank you for that. And so I would love to just dive in with this idea of freedom dreaming. So Dr. Bettina Love talks about it as dreams grounded in the critique of injustice. So given that context, what is that big dream that you hold for education?
Yes, that word justice has a very broad definition. There's used to be Southern Poverty Law. It's now called Learning for Justice, right? And it talks about a lot of inequalities that exist. And if the inequalities exist in a preschool, they're going to exist in post-secondary choices. And it goes on and it spirals. And as far as injustice, there's all types of things that would go under that umbrella, including students with different color, right? Who don't fit, quote unquote, the norm. Why should someone, and the statistics point out that unfortunately a lot of students of color are put in that special ed population, which doesn't mean that they are one of the IDEA classifications, but if you compare some of the behaviors of someone of color, a student of color, to someone not of color, and the same behaviors they exhibit, they might be tracked into special ed sooner than someone else who doesn't have that racial characteristic. And it doesn't mean that everyone is going to get the same treatment. We're not all the same. That's not what equity means. But injustice means that we have to try to give everyone what they need to learn. Certain cultures learn better in groups, so we'll do more cooperative activities because they like that. Whereas other cultures, families don't question professionals because la maestro, they're thinking that they have all the answers. But together we have all the answers to try to diminish some of the injustice that exists out there. Because, especially in the Admire book, I have one of the chapters that talks about think individuals, not categories. And that means that, yeah, the kid might have ADHD, but that doesn't define who he, she, or they are. We want to capitalize on strengths to minimize what might be viewed as a difference is not a deficiency. It's just a characteristic that might be different than quote unquote the norm of the class.
Mm. Love that. I love that you're getting into all of the different things, right? Kind of the racialization of students and student bodies and behaviors, and how that also influences who is in the classrooms, and not even meeting the idea of classifications. Like, so fascinating. Thank you for naming that. And I do love so much of the pieces in your book, particularly that piece around individuals, not categories, and the idea of strengths, not deficiencies. And so for me, that's certainly a mindset shift that I've seen in teachers I coach, and even my own special education teacher journey, right? Is like, this is really important to kind of shift that common perspective of like, here's all these needs versus like, here's actually all these strengths. Like, my students think brilliantly, and maybe like the communication avenue is the struggle, but like, let's harness that brilliant thinking, right? So I'm curious, is that like the main mindset shift required, would you say, for educators? Are there other mindset shifts that are really helpful when we're talking about inclusion and students with IEPs?
Yeah, that's a great framework for it as well. And we want to make sure that we capitalize on strengths. That is essential. And yours, mine, and theirs, and families might be overwhelmed, but also they might have great strength that maybe they're going to come in and talk to the class, or do something and help their child to learn. Same thing with a paraprofessional who's working with a special ed teacher. They might not know what to do, but their strength is listening and following directions. So we need to direct people sometimes to maximize their strengths and set that situation with research-based practices, like universal design for learning, right? The book has a lot of evidence-based practices. It's not just the flavor of the month. It talks a lot about how it looks in the classroom when I'm teaching blank, whether it's fractions, meiosis, or the letter C has two sounds. We have to try to get learners to realize that maybe their strength is not auditory, but maybe it's tactile. So we do silly stuff like, solve to write letters, fun stuff. Nobody says this has to be difficult or boring for kids or the teachers. It just has to be that word in the legislation, which is under broad interpretation and it's called appropriate. So I think it's appropriate, back to your original question, to just capitalize on strengths, capitalize on the teacher's strengths, whether they're veteran teachers or new to the field, we all have strengths. And that's what we need to focus on to move ahead.
Absolutely. And it makes me think, again, along this line of like the strengths, like totally lean on those strengths. And also coupled with that, kind of the idea that we still want to appropriately challenge students, right? And like have those high expectations that they can do things. I often see, and I have certainly have been the person, the teacher who has said like, oh, I'm just going to hyper scaffold this and I'm going to put in all these extra supports because like I'm not sure that they'll be successful, versus more scaffolding in the moment and like what does each individual need, right? Like all that stuff. And what it makes me think of is this common question that I get from teachers of like, okay, what's the difference between accommodations and modifications? And you have some really interesting language around this kind of concept as well. I'd love to hear just kind of your thoughts and talk through that.
Right. We go back to a fairy tale, Goldilocks or a tale, whatever, not too much, not too little, just right. What does that look like? The researcher was Vygotsky, the zone of proximal development. You want the work to be a little bit harder, but not so hard that it's frustrating, but you want a challenge, critical thinking skills. But what if the kid makes a mistake? Love mistakes. We call that error analysis. There's a math thing in a middle school where it's a video. I love this one. It's called My Favorite Mistake. And they collect all the exit cards from, the students at the end of the session. And the next lesson begins with my favorite mistake. No names mentioned, no stigmatization, because we're going to learn that way. It's experiential. John Dewey, we learn by doing. We need to step away from the scripted lesson plan because kids don't exist there. So between an accommodation and a modification, so accommodation perhaps, is where I am not diluting the original standard, but I'm helping you to access the standard. So let's say you had closed captioning put on for a child with dyslexia, and it wasn't a spelling test where they had to write the words, that would be an accommodation, right? Or you would perhaps have a math test that had 20, but the questions and the child didn't have enough stamina to do those questions. And they were all similar. So maybe you narrowed it down to 10 or you put it in 2 sittings. But a modification might be if everyone else is working on multisyllabic words in reading, this student is working on just CVC words, consonant, vowel, consonant, one syllable, because that is their level. And if it was more than that, they'd be frustrated. The caveat is we don't stop there. We do something called progress monitoring. We do something called assessment, informal and formal assessment, 4 to 6 weeks, week, every other day, sound drills, whatever it takes, math quizzes, online tools, handheld tools. We do different things, but a modification would be if the child wasn't able to complete the same task. But that doesn't mean if a child is in a chemistry class, he or she or they can't work cooperatively with peers under a scripted thing if their academic level wasn't there, if they learned turn taking, if they had a specific role that they were there. So it has to be, even if it's a modification, it also has to be age appropriate and interest appropriate. There's a lot of caveats. I know I'm being greedy here, but you asked the question, and first thing we want to look at accommodations, and then if not, modifications. And that goes back to the SDI, the specially designed instruction in a student's individual educational program, IEP.
Hi, this is Leah popping in to share the free resource for this episode, a webpage titled Inclusion Tools by Toby Karten. On it, you can find many links to resources that are connected from today's episode. You can find it at the blog post for this episode, www.lindsaywithlyons.com/223. Now back to the show.
Oh my gosh, I just want to lift up 2 things you said that were just so good. We don't stop there, right? Like we don't just stop and say, oh, well, this is just their level. Guess that'll be that forever. Like that, I think, is very commonly what we do, and we can't. So I love that you named that. And I also love that you're just like, the age and interest appropriate thing is really, really important. And I think the interest piece, I was just in a coaching call yesterday with people who were like, we have to learn to know our students in our classes so that we can get the interests information so that we can then personalize, again, to your point of like the scripted is not going to work for all the students because everyone has different like motivations and interests and all of those pieces. They're individual humans, right? So I'm just resonating so much with what you're saying. Thank you for that. And I know you have a ton of tools. You even started naming some of them, but I'm wondering if you can share maybe like the Admire framework or any specific actions that could support teachers, when they're thinking about designing instruction and making it personal and thinking about those accommodations for students to help them be successful, leaning on their strengths, all that stuff.
Yeah, and one of my favorite, I make people do things in the book, right? Because it's experiential, I said. So it's better than just reading the words. So you could have a piece of paper or a pencil next to it. I'm actually going out with this book in Arizona on Sunday. And I'm excited because I know it sounds silly, I'm the author, but I'm excited to see it again in action. And that's what we need to do, is to put these things in action. So we say connect to students. So the book has something like a learner profile. What are the strengths? What are the challenges? What VAKT, visual, auditory, kinesthetic, tactile. Some kids are movers and shakers. And I'm tired of, like, I was a teacher for a very long time in a school district in New Jersey and Brooklyn, if you hear any accent there. But one thing that I always did, that fake errand for the kid who needed to move. Well, there's ways to get movement in the classroom beyond that fake errand, and having kids moving around, scanning devices, using their devices to scan QR codes, talking to each other in centers and stations, and having a classroom that's set up. So that's what the book invites people to do. And the Admire framework is very basic. The acronym itself stands for assess and activate, decide and delineate, model and monitor, instruct and involve, reflect and revise, and engage and enrich. And you can enrich a child with an IEP as well, not just the gifted students. And the book talks about the inclusion paradigm and the fact that there's going to be mixed abilities in there. So it gives specific examples, like one of the inclusion principles is step by step. So believe it or not, I have you trying to do a step by step origami. Just to create a level of frustration without enough instructions. But then I have you go to a video online that explains it, because some people like videos and like things repeated. Our students' working memories, whether they have an IEP or not, and professionals aren't the same. So I came up with the Admire framework to kind of house it. And under that are 65 different actions that people could do under there. So, like, one of the things is assess and activate prior knowledge. And we could do that. And the book has templates with interest inventories, valuing emotional check-ins. How do we do that? Because it's not just about the academics, but sometimes and often, and anyone in the field of education is nodding their head now, just as you are, Lindsay, that, it's more than just knowing the concepts. It's wanting to know the concepts. It's feeling that I can, and that self-efficacy, and not having that, inclusion anxiety, whether you're a student in the class or whether you're a professional or a family member, but having that mindset, we're going to succeed. We are going to succeed, and here's how.
Yes, thank you for that. And you mentioned just now inclusion anxiety. I was really interested in that part of the book, and I would love if you could elaborate on that just a little bit for us and tell us what it's about and what that research shows.
Yeah, it could be a feeling of discomfort, stress, worry. I work with so many students that were conscious of where I was standing in the room, and if other students saw me standing near them, because they didn't want to be viewed by their peers as being different. I was recently coaching a 4th grade class, and they were reading, I believe it was James and the Giant Peach, and they all had their copy of the book, but I found an online copy through the Sherlock Holmes Center in Rhode Island. They have great PDFs of literature, and I'll give you that link that if you want to include with that. And a few of the others are my favorite tips for our listeners, because we need to spread the word hummingbird. So anyway, I had that copy of it, but the specific student who needed that copy refused to take it because none of the other students had it. He or she was feeling anxiety because of difference. Inclusion anxiety could be that from the perspective of the student. What do my peers think of me? Or I'm going to sit there and nod my head, because when the teacher asks questions, I'm not going to ask a question. But what if the teacher flipped that and said, everyone has to ask a question on an index card, and collected them? Right? There's ways to circumvent that. Inclusion anxiety also exists for professionals. I've been there myself, where someone from the child study team in New Jersey came up to me and said, here's the new kid. And I didn't know that new kid before. Should I have been prepped ahead of time? Yeah. Did I experience some anxiety? Yeah, because I wanted to do that thing. And the book is big on that. And I have a ton of planners in there. I wanted to do the mega planning, the pre planning, and be prepared, be proactive rather than reactive. And that deletes a lot of the anxiety. And, the reason that I keep writing these kinds of professional materials for educators, administrators, and families is the fact that I want to delete the anxiety and I want to replace that with a way to do this step by step. It's okay. I don't know everything. I need to know about mitosis, right? So, how am I going to teach this and support a student if I'm a special ed support teacher or co teacher? Well, you know what? Sal Khan makes great videos on mitosis, right? I could go to PHET. They have excellent things. It's sharing our knowledge with each other. Whether the special ed teacher needs to know more from the gen ed teacher needs to know more from the special ed or the family or related service providers, such as an occupational therapist. If the child has autism, and not everyone is the same strategies with the same label as we spoke about, because we have to think individuals, but we also have to think appropriate. And I keep mentioning that word. And anxiety is inappropriate for anyone. It doesn't help. A degree of anxiety might get your juices flowing with brain research and all that, but too much anxiety, kids, professionals, going to shut down. And that negates collaboration and sharing awareness and knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you cited in the book the research that said, yeah, their academics actually decrease as a result of inclusion anxiety and their well-being decreases. I mean, like two things that were like, we definitely want more of these, like, and they're going down, right?
Yeah, so in the book, there's a framework at the end of each chapter, and that one is admire wellness is one of the frameworks. How are we going to do that, right? Beyond Go Noodle, just different ways to breathe without your device telling you it's time to breathe.
Yes. Oh my gosh, I love that reference. So you had mentioned briefly kind of the mega, macro, and micro planning just now. Do you mind talking us through kind of those differences and why you might
I
do all?
love that. I love that. That came from a former book of mine that's no longer in print, but now it is. It's in the Admire framework, right? I recycle that because I love this, and I've used it on so many campuses with pre-service teachers. I once had a math program here. I was an adjunct professor at your university here, and I made a Master of Arts in Teaching, and these were teachers who graduated with Spanish degrees and history degrees and English degrees, and they were going into teaching at the secondary level. And I made them map out their whole school year, whether it was chemistry or whether it was world history, American history, English, French. They hated me. But I didn't make them do it totally before they went into the classroom student teaching. I just made them do the mega, the big picture each quarter or trimester if your campus has that. Then from there, each month. And then from there, thinking about maybe the weeks, right? So you break it down. I know we have daily planners as well, but if you work in a school, you know that the evacuation drills and the nurse checkups and the assemblies, suddenly the day schedule gets changed a bit, right? But if you have a big picture in mind, and it also, the mega, macro, and micro planning, it has you have it in each part. Times you're going to do repetition, enrichment, practice. So even though you did it in the first quarter, you're going to repeat it in the third quarter because they need those skills to move on. And you don't have to do it in a big way, but maybe having choice boards, centers. So maybe it was out of your protocol to do something like that, but kids need that. The kids who know the most, the kids who know the least, they can't forget about the stuff just because they got 100 on the test, right? They need to review and practice because that's how we learn. Neuroscience supports that.
Absolutely. And I think that's what really I struggle with the scripted kind of curriculum is like there's no room for personalization. There's no room to be like, like I need this. I love that you plan out quarter by quarter, month by month, and then week by week because like once you like before you have your students, right, and you're planning the year in July and you've never met one of them before, right? Like how do you know what they need? Like you don't.
Right. And things are going to happen in that place called a school that you never anticipated. Teachers are good at adapting, modifying, accommodating, and all of that. But when you have a general plan, it helps. It alleviates that anxiety because you're proactive. Is it going to change? Probably, but at least you know I am going to do, decomposing of numbers 0 through 19 the first quarter, and then move on. And maybe it'll have to be repeated, but it is a choice, and you are having a proactive attitude rather than reactive. That's important.
Absolutely. I think it strikes that perfect balance that we kind of were talking about earlier of like the high expectations and challenge and not just like
Yes.
making things super easy, right? We're accommodating and personalization, which kids need. So I really like that framework that you have. I also wanted to ask about, I think there's a lot of like challenges educators probably special educators and educators in general education classes and particularly, here's the one where it blends the two. I have heard a lot of challenges around co-taught classes. So where there's a special education teacher and a general education teacher in the same class. That's certainly one I was curious to ask you about, just like any recommendations or things that you've found to be helpful, or are there other challenges that you want to kind of name and talk through?
No, that's a great question. And co-teaching is fabulous. I've been a co-teacher myself. I've supervised co-teachers. I facilitated professional development sessions just on co-teaching. And no co-teacher is alike with their co-teacher, but if you do get on the same vibes, and great years, you even end up wearing the same colors, you finish each other's sentences, you have so much fun. I have a very dear friend who's a co-teacher, and I have to share this. She said to me, it's my first year teaching and I'm going to make a lot of mistakes, right? And I looked at her and I said, it's my umpteenth year teaching and I'm not perfect either. I might be here and I wrote a couple of books, but I don't have a halo over my head either. So the first thing is an awareness that we bring to the table as co-teachers. Each of us has different skill sets and different things we could do better. She taught me how to organize in world history class. I never made a better outline in my life or understood how to do it until she did it. However, I might have helped her keep her job because I reviewed the comments she was sending to the families, which she never did before. And I said, yeah, that's kind of good, but you might want to edit it and soften it a little bit, right? And it's how we correspond with each other and how we get a vibe and how we honor each other's skill set. So that's the first thing about co-teaching. And it's also mindfulness from the administration and how you're pairing teams together, listening to your staff, and that collaboration exists with families, it exists with gen ed and special ed, and there's been situations where co-teaching has a broad definition, and maybe the SLP, speech and language pathologist, is there for a period of time, or the guidance counselor. Think broadly in co-teaching, and co-teaching is not a way to save money. It's not a way for me to sit in the back of the room and mark papers while someone else is doing something. I mentioned centers. What a great thing. Someone could be circulating while they're doing centers. Someone could work with a small group, gen ed or special ed, for practice enrichment. And that's one thing about co-teaching that you want to always make sure that you do, that you don't create a special ed classroom within the gen ed classroom and stigmatizing students as being lower level because they're in the smaller group. The groups are there for random, interest-based, could be skill-based, right? But it has to be a situation where you're capitalizing on each other's strengths as co-teachers. And that's, has nothing to do with age, or lack of experience or too much experience. It has to do with using our experiences wisely.
Yeah, one of the things I love that you mentioned in the book is that you could rotate, right? Like the enrichment, actually the special education teacher is going to lead the enrichment today. Like, right, and just that it doesn't always have to be like you're helping the kids that are struggling and you're helping the kids that are doing great. Like, I love that idea. Super cool.
Yeah. I love being a co-teacher. And I used to have papers like, with WH chart, where, when, why, how, that as a graphic organizer. And I put it out there. And then other kids go, can we take one? And I say, no, only if you have an IEP. No, I don't say that, but that's it. It's a strategy. Let's share our strategies with each other.
Oh, brilliant example. That resonates deeply. So I think in the final kind of closing questions, I'll just ask, I think there's 3 questions. We'll do kind of like a lightning round to wrap up.
Okay.
One thing you would encourage the audience to do once they end the episode. So we've talked about a lot of different things. What's like a good kind of, they're walking into work tomorrow and they want to do something small to kind of put something into action. What would you recommend?
Easy answer. Smile. Look at that person in the mirror and smile, because you are a good person and you are trying to help students succeed. And I'm not diminishing other professions, but take care of that person in the mirror, because if you don't take care of you, you're not good for everyone else as well.
Oh, that's good. Thank you for that. Now, what is something you have been learning about lately? It could totally relate to education and work, but it could also be totally something not related to your work.
Yeah, I'm doing a lot of work with, well, let me think about this. If I want to do personal or professional, give you a quick lightning answer of both. Professional, I'm doing work with leveraging collaboration. And I'm researching a lot about listening skills, because people think they're listening, but they're not really hearing. And that's something to leverage collaboration. We have to better understand how to listen. And I'm guilty of that too. I've listened to podcasts where people ask me a question and I went off on something. We need to respond to each other appropriately, and students need to learn that. I act it out with them when they toss a ball and they have to speak, when only if they catch it. So you catch what someone else does. And something I'm learning on a personal level is, I spoke about movement, move more. So I mentioned I had an issue with my computer. So the good thing is that I've learned that if you're not on the computer as much, I average 12,000 steps a day. That is a nice thing as opposed to 2,000 on the computer. So there's ups and downs of things. And I'm learning not to judge yourself. Go back to that person in the mirror and get that yin yang balance.
Oh, that's great. I love that you shared one of each. That's really good. And then finally, people are going to want to connect with you, get the book, which we'll certainly link to in the show notes. But how do they follow kind of what you're doing? Do you have an online presence or a place where people could reach out to you?
Absolutely. My website, inclusionworkshops.com. You will find my contact information. Toby at inclusionworkshops.com is my email. I also have KIC, Karten's Inclusion Conversations podcast, available on channels that you could listen to. And on my website, I have several inclusion tools, especially you also mentioned about co-teaching. I have several on there too. So I'd be very happy to give you several of those links to share with everyone.
Absolutely. We'll drop them right into the blog post and show notes. Toby, thank you so much for this conversation. It was wonderful.
Lindsay, thank you so much.
If you like this episode, I bet you'll be just as jazzed as I am about my coaching program for increasing student-led discussions in your school. Shane Safir and Jamila Dugan talk about a pedagogy of student voice in their book, Street Data. They say students should be talking for 75% of class time. Do students in your school talk for 75% of each class period? I would love for you to walk into any classroom in your community and see this in action. If you're smiling to yourself as you listen right now, grab 20 minutes on my calendar to brainstorm how I can help you make this big dream a reality. I'll help you build a comprehensive plan, from full-day trainings and discussion protocols like Circle and Socratic Seminar to follow-up classroom visits where I can plan, witness, and debrief discussion-based lessons with your teachers. Sign up for a nerdy, no-strings-attached brainstorm call at lindsaybethlyons.com/contact. Until next time, leaders, think big, act brave, and be your best self.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. Explore more podcasts at www.teachbetterpodcastnetwork.com. We'll see you on the next episode.